Hi everyone, this is Grace, and today I'll be walking you through how I made this plant babies, or so I like to call it, set of 11 different potted plants. So this is a pretty long video, over an hour, because there are 11 different designs and they're not simple. So buckle up, let's go. I did originally make this set for a class at intermediate level. So we're definitely stepping it up a notch here with techniques, and let's get started. So this first one, and pardon me, I don't remember the name of all of these plants. I think this is the elephant ear. For the most part, on the pots, I did one consistency to outline and flood, but in this case, I decided to do two because of the nice sharp edges on this hexagon. uh, 6 sides, right? Had to go back to my geometry days. Just because I find that one consistency is a little hard to get nice sharp edges. I'm still using what I gather is probably like a thicker consistency to flood that in, and it's pretty small, so that's fine. Now, this painting here is the Sugar Art Sterling Pearl in Wedding Gold. It is the only sterling pearl, or I should say luster dust, that I use. It's totally edible. Um, Love it. I still have some experimenting to do though with some other kinds of techniques. Like this painting is done with the dry dust mixed with either the Sugar Arts color solution or a high alcohol content clear alcohol. My preference is Everclear. It's not an alcohol that you want to drink. Or you could use a high alcohol content vodka. The reason why those things work is because the alcohol evaporates. So just something to keep in mind. What I've been wanting to try though, which I just keep forgetting, I don't know. I find that painting edible luster dust can be challenging, especially on larger surfaces. Something this size is fine, but every time I try to paint something larger, it's just like streaky and doesn't look good. But something that you can do with the Sugar Arts color solution, which I just haven't tried yet, is to actually paint the color solution on the dried icing and then use the luster dust dry to cover the surface, if that makes sense. Cover like the color solution painted surface. So I think that works way better in terms of covering large surfaces, and I've just been meaning to try it and haven't yet. So there are a lot of different ways you can use these luster dusts. You can use them dry, you can use them wet. So this set, I believe I'm only showing you how to do it wet, but there's one instance I just told you about like painting on the color solution first and then covering that with the dry dust. And there's another instance later for Splatter that I will tell you about, where you could use it dry instead of wet. So for these elephant ears here, for the most part, I think I freehanded just about everything. If that freaks you out, freehanding, you can definitely use an edible marker to actually mark this out. The only thing to keep in mind is just to make sure you're making it like slightly smaller than you ultimately want it, because you have to make sure you cover up that edible marker with the icing. So just keep that in mind, my friends. That's why I like to freehand, because it's just, I don't know, in my head it's easier. And these are plants, right? So they don't need to all look exactly the same. This here I love overlapping with the pot. I just think it adds so much delightful dimension. You do need to make sure that you add a good amount of icing to that bottom leaf, to make sure that it doesn't crater, because you realize you're like straddling two different heights of icing or surface, the base cookie and then the pot, which is a layer of icing. Um, if you wanted to, you could add a little squiggle of icing to, especially just around the pot, just to extra prevent it from over flooding, or not over we're not talking about overflooding, cratering. So yeah, just something to keep in mind. Just adding some little detail here. I did a soft peak piping consistency for almost all of the piping consistency. I'll tell you about the ones where I don't, but that is the first of 11. Go us. Okay, this is the second pot. Apparently I took out using the edible marker. So in this case, okay, this terracotta color. I need to remember how I made this terracotta color. Hold on a second. Okay, this terracotta color. Now, I am not a color expert, but I started with a reddish orange. So definitely more red than yellow. And then to kind of dull it out and create this terracotta effect, I added some brown icing to it. And obviously I have brown icing in the rest of the set. That's how I did it. I'm sure there's more specific color theory to this to kind of dull out orange, but here we are. So for this pot, I wanted it to look like a textured clay pot. So I let that base layer dry pretty well. And then I'm just using some of this thick flood again. This might even be like an extra thick flood to just paint that on top. And it's important that I'm using a brush that's going to kind of give it a little bit of texture. So it is like a flat brush, but I'm making sure that I'm keeping the texture of the bristles. And I didn't do that super precisely because I knew I'd be covering that top bit with icing. So this is one of 2 designs that I did with this type of leaf piping. So the first thing is to just mark out generally the stems for this. A lot of these stems are going to get covered anyway. So yeah. I will note that I didn't come up with any of these designs. Well, some of the pots are more my brainchild, but the actual designs of the plants came from Kaleidacuts, the company that actually designed these cutters. So they drew them out. I made them into a cookie. So this leaf here, it's not super, I think this is supposed to be a pothos plant. And this texture technique is obviously not very authentic to a pothos. But I really wanted to make sure that we covered this technique in this class because it's so versatile and important. We are using a medium peak. You could also use a stiff peak. That'd be a little hard on your hand, but definitely nothing softer than a medium peak. Like you can't do a soft peak for this because you need the texture to hold its shape. With a soft peak, it might look like this when you first pipe it, but when it sits for a couple minutes, it's gonna like melt together. So this is a medium peak. I am using a tipless bag, and the way that you get this shape is by cutting a V into the tipless bag. So I usually like to cut it, I don't know if I can explain this, so that the bag is flat with the seam on one side and the fold on the other. And then I cut a V into it as opposed to cutting a V out of it. That's not making any sense. Like directing. So it has a V cut out of it, and then you have to fold the bag so it's 180 degrees. Change the orientation to make it a V. Y'all, I'm sorry. Trying to verbally explain this is hard. Good news is though, in my class, in the workbook, I show you, I have pictures in the workbook of how to cut this leaf tip. I also show you how to do it obviously in the class. So yeah, but it is, I'll talk a bit more about this later, but it's a sawing motion back and forth. Basically, like imagine you're cutting a slice of bread and it's that back and forth motion. So easy peasy lemon squeezy. I mean, how cool is that? Love it. Okay. Next up, we have the Monstera plant. So for all of these pots, I wanted to create some dimension, maybe not on all of them, for most of them. Obviously the first 2 I didn't do this to, but I do this technique to most of them. So the way I created the dimension first is taking the extra thick flood of the pot and just obviously painting some out and getting enough icing to cover what will be kind of the cutout. I wanted there to still be a bit of a rim. So this is that extra thick flood again. And I just piped a line, and now I'm using the brush to kind of do a brush embroidery to like integrate the line into what I'd already painted. So that gives like just enough dimension, 3D dimension to it. I didn't want to have the rim in the back to be too big because I'm ultimately going to be piping stems and leaves over that rim. So if it was like too 3D, then it would make piping over it a little awkward, if that makes sense to anyone. This brown here, again, this is how I do color. I don't think this is the most authentic color theory. I hear one of my best friends, she's an art teacher in my head, also my mother, she's a painter. They know color theory better than I do. But anyway, this is just a chocolate brown that I've added black to because I wanted it to be like a taupey brown situation, not like, I wanted like a clay brown, not like a dirt brown. I think there's a difference. Okay, so this is one of 2 pots that has this basket weave, and we do it 2 different ways. You get to see it 2 different ways. This piping on top is actually medium peak. Yes, you heard that right. I normally do a soft peak for piping details, but in this case, we're doing like a 3D piping and detail situation. So the icing really needs to be able to hold its shape. Now, as I'm saying this out loud, I'm realizing you probably could get away with a soft peak, but you would want these first lines to crust first and then go in with your soft peak. Now, I personally do not like these first lines to crust before I do the next layer. And the reason for that is it's very easy to knock the first set of lines as you're doing this technique. And if you ever knock slightly crusted icing, it does not look pretty. So in this case, I think it's more forgiving to do the second layer when the first set of lines is still wet. So if you knock into it, it's not gonna like leave crusty bits, if that makes any sense. So what we're doing here is we're actually lifting the icing over the first line. So in the land of basket weaves, I would say this is like medium difficulty, because I would a higher difficulty I think would be an even tighter weave, which is just even more piping, which takes even more time. And honestly, my hand is hurting just thinking about this right now. You definitely do not want to have a lot of cookies that have a basket weave this tight on it. And doing something even tighter would be even more exhausting. So just something to keep in mind. But obviously, when I put a class together, and really any set that I do, because I'm a content creator, I'm always trying to teach you as many different techniques and approaches as I can. That's kind of one of the theories behind the shape series sets that I do, that I want to show you how many different ways you can do the same thing, you know, and make it your own. Or create variety. Like you can have an entire set that's just Easter egg shapes, and look how many different things you can do with it. So for this one, I did the basket weave twice in 2 different orientations, just so you can see how differently they look. In this case, the initial lines are going horizontal, but you'll see in the second one, the initial lines go vertically. So funsies. Something also to keep in mind with basket weave is make sure you cut a big enough tip, because obviously like the smaller the tip, the more lines you'll have to do, and the tighter of a weave you'll have to do to make it look tight enough, if that makes any sense. Yeah, so this is definitely a bit bigger than my usual cut. Like I usually cut piping consistency, like outlining to 4 or 5 millimeters. This I would say is more like 5 to 6-ish, maybe. Maybe it's more like on the 5 end. Let's say I do more like 4. So like this here is more like 4. And again, I am freehanding this because YOLO. And you'll see with this one, so that line through the middle of the leaf is to create some separation. And you'll see in a minute. I believe I should do it now. Yeah, there we go. So I'm adding this second layer to that line for a reason. And you'll see why when I start flooding this. Now, for this video, but also generally, I did not let the outlines of the leaves dry, because if you don't let them dry and you go in with your flood right away, then they can more seamlessly melt together, and I just prefer that look. That's a bit more of an advanced technique to do though, so the easier, quote unquote easier way to do it is to let your outline dry, because obviously your outline is like it's like the fence that holds everything in, and the drier the icing, the stronger your fence is, basically. If the icing is still wet, then the fence is kind of still wobbly, and you have to just be a lot more certain with yourself. So this flood here, I believe that I used a thick and an extra thick flood for most of my leaves and whatnot. Okay, friends, I just checked. All of my floods in this set are a thick flood. And the reason for that is that all of this flooding space is pretty small. There's no need for a thinner flood to make it easier to flood something large. And since these are all pretty small, you know, one way to prevent craters is to use the thickest consistency possible for the application. So a thick flood is still very manageable for this set. I will say the size of these cutters is pretty sizable. I'm pretty sure they're all between like 4 and 5 inches, which, to be totally honest, I almost wish that they were like a 1/4 of an inch smaller. But it's hard, I don't know, because if they were a 1/4 of an inch smaller, then it would have made some of these leaves like quite a bit more challenging to do, because smaller is not always easier. Bigger is not always easier. Like, there is a sweet spot size for designs and cutters, in my opinion, because small and big have their own challenges. So when it's really small, obviously your like line work has to be a lot more intricate, and you have to have a lot more precision to get small. Big though, you're going to run into trouble if your icing is not thin enough. For example, if you're flooding a really large space, I've had this happen plenty of times where my icing is like a little too thick for the size of the cookie, my flood icing, I should say. And so as I'm flooding it, like, it's already crusting on the side, which is not ideal. Oh, I forgot to talk about, see that seam in the middle? I think the leaf on the left is a bit easier to look at. So to get that seam, the first, like, you really have to do the 2-layer outline, because if you don't, it's like not quite enough separation for the flood that you're putting in between it. And that's how you can get that that seamless seam in between them. Ha ha ha, pun intended. Sorry, that was a bad joke, y'all. I've got some tea on the side to keep me hydrated for this session. All right, that is the Monstera. Don't know why that had an accent. Okay. Now, I thought that this was like a double cacti, but someone said maybe the one on the right is a... Oh, shoot. Oh my gosh, brain fart. Succulent. that the one on the right might be a succulent and not a cactus. I don't know. What's the difference between a cactus and a succulent? Lord, someone in the comments inform me. I am not a plant lady. I am a cookie lady. Okay. The little things I did in the corner might not be totally necessary. It's just to cover the little bit of corner that is not going to be covered by this part of the flood or by the cactus itself. It's like the tiniest little bit of corner. And if you forgot to do that, no biggie, y'all. No biggie. So this one is ultimately going to get painted gold. Love that. Some people who use edible luster dusts will, the flood or the icing, whatever that they plan on painting, they'll make it as close of a color to the luster dust as possible, like a slightly gold icing or like a gray icing for silver. I personally don't do that because I just can't be bothered. Sometimes that means I don't have the best coverage because edible luster dust doesn't always have the best even coverage for large spaces like I've talked about, but it's good enough for me. So we're doing some crackle here, which was obviously my addition to make this more like Grace because I love crackle, you know? We know this. The crack happens. We're at cracking stage. Anywhere from like 10 to 20 minutes after you flood the icing. It all just depends on the environment you're working in and the thickness of your icing. So I usually set a timer for 10 minutes and I check it after that. So I let that dry almost completely, or at least a lot, so that I could then paint it. And in this case, I never struggle with painting crackle. It always looks good. Like not in the way that I struggle with painting flat surfaces. Now, I'm doing it in this order because I firmly believe if you can, that it makes your life so much easier to do any like large space painting like this before you do the section next to it. So what we could have done is cracked the white and then immediately moved on to this stage because the icing is dry enough to be flooding next to it like this. But then we probably, like, we would have flooded this first section of the cactus and maybe even the second section. And then when it came to painting next to it, it's just so much harder. It's more stressful to get a perfect seam painting luster dust next to already dried icing. It's not impossible, but I've just had enough hip mishaps because if you don't get just the right amount of liquid on your paintbrush, then it's very easy for it to puddle, to pool, especially in a seam next to dried icing. So in this case, I was able to paint much more freely and less stressfully. Paint more freely and less stressfully. So it was a little messy, and that doesn't matter because look, y'all, we're just covering it up with the section next to it. That does create kind of, if you can say, problems in terms of timing, because you do have to let the icing dry enough to paint on top of it. I'm always a little overly cautious about how long to wait before painting because I'm so paranoid that I'm gonna ruin the icing if I paint too soon, because if you paint too soon and the icing's not dry enough, then it can create little like tiny holes in the surface of your icing, which is not ideal, obviously. So that's not a great answer about how dry it needs to be, but I would say like mostly dry. Doesn't have to be completely dry. So this is just some little piping detail on this cactus, cacti, succulent, whatever it's called. This is all soft peak. That white is soft peak. This green is soft peak. And then I am immediately moving in with these dots. Again, same thought process. I prefer to do like a second layer like this on top of wet piping. Just makes it less stressful if you do knock into the line with your dot. This is where having a true soft peak is very helpful, because you can see that the dots are already kind of settling on their own. If it wasn't a true soft peak and it was more like a medium peak, then these would be like itty bitty Hershey kisses all over the cactus. Meaning they would all the white dots would have a peak on them. Some people are super anal and will go in and settle those peaks, and y'all, oh my god, I just can't. Okay. I don't know why I'm whispering, but I feel like everyone needs to know that. Okay, no more whispering. I always talk about this. I have patience, but not that much patience. So this next one is, I believe, called the Chinese money plant. And we're doing the same little technique here. I just used the edible marker to kind of guide me to know how much I want to cover, because I do need to have a pretty clean top on this. I just got lost in my thoughts. Okay. So probably most ideally, that inset painting thing I just did, you'd let that dry for a couple minutes before moving on to this next stage. But y'all, I'm impatient, especially when I'm filming. If I don't have to wait for something to dry, chances are I won't. But you might see that the seam of this section is a little bit more melty than ideal because I didn't wait for the painting part to dry first. And c'est la vie. It's all good. Using my favorite scribe here from Borderlands Bakery. Sadly, they don't sell it anymore. What I love about it is that if you can kind of see, there's a little heart, silver heart, that's flat on the top of it, and that just lays perfectly on my hand to brace it. So big fan. Okay, here is wet splatter, and this is the least messy way to do it, but it also gives you the most inconsistent splatter. So if you're looking for a really consistent wet splatter, I would use a paintbrush, but for that you need to have a glove, and I just don't always like to do that. Another way to do that splatter, though, which is actually becoming probably my favorite way to do like chunky inconsistent splatter, is to actually use the luster dust dry. And you do that with obviously a dry brush, like a dry clean brush that you just stick into the luster dust. And then you do that when the icing is wet. And y'all, when it dries, it is like even big chunks of luster dust have like completely soaked in to the icing, if that makes sense. And so they've completely dried. Because one of the common problems with painting with luster dust is that it will actually, even when it's like quote unquote dry, it will kind of come off on your fingers or your cellophane bag if it gets rubbed. A way to help prevent that is when the icing and the luster dust is totally dry, you can paint the cookie, or brush the cookie with cornstarch. I find that doesn't always work, especially if you're a little too heavy-handed with your luster dust. So keep that in mind. But the dry method, I'm always amazed at how it completely dries. So for these here, I am doing the squiggle technique to help prevent craters. You can see I inconsistently did that throughout the set. I don't know. I don't think that this squiggle method always works, so I don't always use it. I prefer to go with just using the thickest consistency possible. That's my usual approach. I did find though that these this technique worked pretty nicely here, but I want to keep in mind that this green is my thick flood. So I've tried doing this squiggle technique on balloons, that are obviously a bit bigger. And when I say squiggle, I mean like this kind of big blob squiggle, not like a true zigzag squiggle. And I find that if the icing is too thin, it actually kind of settles out a bit too much. And sometimes you can even see the squiggle kind of poke through the flood, which is not ideal. So yeah, if you want to if you want to be more conservative with your squiggle, that's probably better, and it would at least not poke through. Maybe it won't actually help prevent a crater, but at least it won't poke through. So in this case, I felt good about this though, because this is a thick flood. So it's it's going to hold its shape a bit better anyway. So this first go on the leaves, I'm leaving out those two because they're touching other leaves. And I want to let these first ones crust. You can see they've crusted now. And then I'm going with my squiggle. I do always like to leave my squiggle wet. So I will squiggle and then immediately flood. This green here, so all of my colors, I almost never use anything straight out of a bottle. I made this green myself. I tend to go with royal blue and lemon yellow as my blue and yellow of choice. So this is definitely a green, slightly more on the yellow side. This here, the leaves have crusted, and we're going in with, again, our soft peak, just to get those dots in there. And she done. Beautiful. All right. If I remember correctly, I think this is the fiddle leaf fern. Fiddle leaf fig? Something to that effect. Anyway, what can I talk about here? So my white icing, I just want to say I did, I don't know, a year ago, maybe-ish. I don't remember when I started, maybe more than a year ago. I did start adding white food coloring to my white, which I didn't always do. I don't think it's necessary, but it does give your white icing more of a pop than it would otherwise. And that the reason why it's not, your icing isn't pure white, unless you're using clear vanilla or like, is almond extract clear? I don't remember. Right, unless you're using a clear flavoring, your flavoring is going to color your icing. So traditional icing is done with vanilla extract. Vanilla extract is obviously kind of brown. I use lemon juice, which is, yes, ever so slightly tinted yellow because it's lemon juice. So the icing will be slightly off-white without food coloring. I don't think people can tell from the naked eye, but I certainly can. So I decided to do 2 different color leaves for this one, just for a little more variety. I don't think that the actual plant itself has 2 different color leaves, but that's fine. Let's talk about the colors here. I did 2 different greens. Actually, technically, this set has 3 different greens, but I'm going to be totally honest. We haven't seen it yet, but my third green, I did not do the best job at differentiating from the dark green. Wah wah. This lighter green, I would say, is a bit more on the yellow side. Then for the dark forest green, I think it's a bit more on the blue side, and then I add black to it. I know, again, this is my, like, am I doing this correctly? I don't know, but it gets me the results that I need, friends. So that's how I make a nice dark, rich forest green. Usually when I'm adding black or brown to an icing to dull it out, or to a color, I mean, to like dull it out or to make it a really dark color, I usually prefer to use some leftover icing in that color as opposed to using black or brown straight out of the tube, just because the amount of color you need to dull it out whatever it is that you're doing is very little. And if you just take like a dab or a spoonful of pre-made icing, um, that is so little color as opposed to how much saturation you get out of a bottle even by using like a toothpick. So if you are using color straight out of a bottle to darken or mute a color, always recommend using a toothpick, and like don't start with an entire drop of black, please. Unless you are making a large amount of icing, chances are you just need like a toothpick amount. This is why it's nice to always keep your leftover icing, not get rid of it. I have a stash of leftover icing in my freezer. I'm pretty lazy about it. I just leave it in the piping bag and put it in a Tupperware, which can make things a little messy because sometimes, like when the icing defrosts, kind of squeezes out into the Tupperware. But anyway, other people who are less lazy than me will like fold under the tip or tape the tip of the bag. Yeah, I should probably do that, but I don't. Doing this little piping detail, and then I'm going to use my tiniest scribe. I love this PME scribe to kind of lop off the edges of it. That just gives it kind of a more, what's the word? Like waterfall effect on those lines, which I like. I always have 3 scribes when I decorate. I have that tiny PME one, which I just used. I have the Borderlands Bakery one, the one with the heart on it. And then a third one, which I don't know if I used in this video, is my pink thingamajiggy. It's the thick plastic pink one that you see me use. It has a scribe on one end and then like a 1-inch scraper on the other end. So versatile, seriously. It is from the Cookie Countess, by the way. It's only like a few dollars for 2. They're not expensive at all. It's just from a specialized shop. So you might just end up buying that, or, you know, poke around, see what else you can buy. But yeah, those are the 3 scribes I always have. They all serve different purposes. You know, different thicknesses of scribes do different things. Yeah, like the thicker the scribe, the more you're going to manipulate the icing. So this here is definitely a cactus. Okay, we've got that straight. We are starting off the bottom of this very similarly. That this is going to be another one of the basket. No, is this a basket? No, this is not a basket weave. I do apologize. This is not. This is some other sort of basket. So you'll see in a minute what I'm doing. Yeah, okay. What else can I talk about here? My cookies, the little black dots is vanilla bean paste. That's what I use in my cookie recipe. It is expensive. I use Nielsen Massey, the one and the only. I don't know. I think it makes a difference in the flavor. But that's also probably because before I was using this, I would use like the fake vanilla extract, the vanilla flavor, because I was too cheap to buy real vanilla extract. So I don't know. But then I decided one day, you know what, I'm going to use vanilla bean paste. And at this point, it's not just the flavor, but obviously it's the look of my cookies too. Like, people know my cookies because they have black specks in them. So will I ever stop using it? I don't know. But I will admit, sometimes my cookies don't get eaten. So it seems a little sad to use such expensive ingredients if they don't get eaten. But that's only when, like, I'm super stressed. And sometimes, since I'm a content creator, right, like, yes, it's good if these cookies are actually edible, but if they aren't, as long as they look good and I film them correctly, then who cares if they don't taste good? So sometimes if I'm really stressed out, like, I will allow myself to leave them in the dehydrator too long. And if they're in the dehydrator too long, then they don't taste good because obviously, like, they've been dehydrated for too long. So that's the other basket situation. Just with some tiny little handles. And then, okay, this is the third blue, or I mean green. I think it looks a little more different here, but in the final photos, it's awfully close to that dark green. So this was supposed to be more like kind of a sage green, definitely more blue in it. I think where I went wrong is that I made it too dark. And by doing, I added too much black to it, so that by the time it got to drying, it was just too dark. Sad face. But again, I mean, was it necessary to make a third green for this set? No, but I did wanted to teach y'all how to make, or like to have a little more variety. So we have 3 different greens and 3 different color pots. So here I am using the squiggle technique for the cactus. Why did I not do that on the other cactus? I don't know. I really don't know. Sometimes my brain is elsewhere. Yeah. And if I recall, I don't think I got craters on that other cactus. Or at least they weren't that pronounced. The other thing too with these 2 cactus designs is that yes, these sections are pretty likely to crater because of the size and the shape. But they both have detail piping on top of them. So even if they do crater, you're going to be covering that up with piping and it will distract from it. So I would not be that concerned, is what I'm trying to say. Often, if I have something that is likely to crater, I might go out of my way to make sure it has some sort of detail piping on top of it so that if it does crater, no one notices. Or sometimes I will add detail piping on top because it did crater and I want to distract people. So anyway, I digress. What's gonna we talk about? So you can see here, I just want to point out with this first like line around the edge, I made sure not to bring the line all the way to the edge. Like I wanted there to be some negative space, I think that's the right word, between the line and the edge of the flood. Visually, I think that's most appealing. Also, it kills my soul a little when people do this flooding in sections and then they just end up outlining right against the seam to the point where then you can't even see the separate section. And I'm like, what was the point of that? Like if you're going to do that, if you're going to bring the seam, the outline all the way to the edge, then you might as well just flood the whole cactus, right? And then you use the detail piping to actually create the different sections. So I digress. I'm all about doing things when it actually makes a difference. Yeah. So here, I want to just bring attention to the fact that I lost my brain when I was piping this, and I totally forgot to do the piping, or like the cutout inset part first. Silly me. And usually when I'm decorating, often I will say the cookie that I'm filming is the last cookie. Now, it used to be when I was filming that I didn't pay attention to which cookie I was filming, and I would get some comments of like, wait, that's not the same cookie each time. Now I make a point of making sure that I'm always filming the same cookie at each stage of the process because I am not a robot, my friends. Newsflash. So each cookie is going to look slightly different. The point of this story, I'm going to pause the story for a second because I want to talk about what I'm doing right here. So I have flooded 2 different colors next to each other while they are still wet. And then I'm going to take my scribe and mess it up. So the idea here was that I wanted it to be like, I wanted it to, I've seen pots like this. I don't know. I think they look cool. I wanted there to be kind of a fading effect from one color to the other. Now, I believe why I lost my brain for a moment. So here I have to go back, and this is not the end of the world, but like obviously it doesn't have the cleanest effect to it. I think this was my last cookie, and I'd already filmed one with the white and the terracotta in the wrong order. I think I'd put the white on top, hand in palm. Excuse me. Okay. Right. So the story I was telling was that and just to say, like, the one that I did in the wrong order with the white on top, in terms of the final product, totally fine to just scrape that off and no one's going to know the difference. Filming, though, it does not work that way, because when you scrape off icing, even if you scrape it off incredibly well, it's going to have dyed the cookie a little bit, so that it's going to have dyed the cookie so that when you go to film it, like, it's obviously not a clean cookie, and that's not ideal. I've only done that like a handful of times when I was desperate, because I'd already filmed all of my cookies. Yeah. And I had nothing else to work with. So, YOLO. Okay. I feel like this is the fiddle leaf. I don't know. It's a cute plant. So for this one, we are actually going to be filling in the leaves in 2 different ways. Fun stuff, right? This first way is the most traditional, of course. Outline, squiggle, use the thick flood. I'm very intentionally only doing a couple leaves at a time so that I can flood them as I go and get the most seamless look possible. It's really important when piping lines to always lift your bag off the surface. It can be kind of hard to tell when I'm piping that I'm doing that at the angle that I'm filming, whatever. Because lifting your bag off can be anywhere from like a couple millimeters to upwards of an inch. And what that does is it allows you to guide the icing and lay the icing down, which gives you the smoothest, cleanest line possible. La-di-da. Sometimes I feel like I run out of things to say. I do prefer to be able to talk through my entire videos. I used to do these tutorial videos where I had music interludes when I ran out of things to say. But just for intellectual property purposes, I like to have the entire video just me talking. So this next one is going to be the other way. Look at that. Oh my God. Same icing. This is actually my soft peak piping consistency. And this is what is so beautiful about a soft peak piping consistency, is that it's like kind of a hybrid icing, in that it is obviously thick enough to be piping consistency, but it is, thick enough to be piping consistency, but it's thin enough that when you assist it to settle, it actually can settle flat. Now, you don't want to do this though in like really large areas, because it's too thick. It is too thick for flooding a larger area. It is a beautiful thing, but can also be kind of frustrating if you don't work fast enough to help it settle. So, why use a soft peak to flood? That's a great question. Remember when I said earlier about helping to prevent craters? The thicker the icing you use, the less likely it is to crater. Flooding with a soft peak, 9 times out of 10, is not going to crater. So these tiny little areas, I could have done what I did with the rest of the leaves, but they were just so small. I was like, let's learn a new technique. Let's learn how to pressure pipe flood with a soft peak. So that's what we did. I'm just mesmerized by my own piping skills. So when you're doing this pressure pipe flooding, there are two ways you can settle it. You can either settle it as you go with the tip of the bag, like I'm kind of doing here, or you can kind of flood it and then use a scribe. I prefer to use the tip of the bag because you get to it faster than if you flooded it, then picked up your scribe and started to settle it. I find that those extra few seconds make all the difference in terms of being able to settle it totally flat. Sometimes you're left with like a bit of a peak where you pulled your scribe out, or the tip of your bag. Not the end of the world, but. And then I had to do a little bit of bear technique on top of this to give, some more texture. Again, we're doing variety here. We did a little ombre texture situation. Love that for us. Now, this technique that I did on top of these leaves, I definitely made up, or at least, I didn't see it somewhere. I was just trying to come up with a different way to add texture on top of these leaves. And this is what I came up with. I guess it's a sort of, what's the word? Brush embroidery, since we are using a brush. And what I'm doing is I've got my soft peak, and contrary to what I normally do, which is just to like pipe a thin line and lift the bag off the surface, I'm actually intentionally kind of keeping the tip of my bag close to the surface of the icing, so that I can get a thicker line of icing. Because I found that when I did when I piped just a single line, it wasn't enough icing to work with to get the desired effect, because I really wanted to be able to like cover most of the leaf with this texture. Now, the key here is to not, or at least I think, because I wanted optimal texture, and you can see especially on the right side, like there's a lot of definition in between each stroke. And the best way to get that is to not over brush this. So you can see I'm only going in with one stroke every time. A lot of times you'll see people do brush embroidery and they'll like go over a section a couple of times with the brush, if that makes any sense. But that creates more of a lacy effect. I was going for more of this optimal texture. I don't know, that's the best way I can describe it. The brush that I'm using here is a small angled brush. I believe, yeah, you can see on the brush handle, this is the Sugar Art. Big fan of their brush set. A lot of great brushes in there. This is a very versatile type of brush that you can use for a lot of different things. I'm using it here. I also used it, I think this is the only brush I used for this entire set. Okay, moving on to another, I think, pothos, but because of how I did the leaves, maybe this is more like a fern, and I'm okay with that. I'm kind of obsessed with both of these fern pothos plants, whatever they're called. I did the same kind of leaf technique on both of them, but they look very different. I mean, obviously the shape helps that. So this is a hanging one. And for this one, we are going to be painting this gold, which is why we're starting off with the white. So this is an instance where I would have been really curious to try that dry dust option to actually paint this whole thing with the color solution first and then dry dust it. I have to, in my memory bank, I need an opportunity to do this. And then, so holding this hanging plant up are these white strings. Yay for us. Now, my white was on the thin side of a soft peak. So this little tie thing at the bottom, I'm actually going to do in 2 layers. And that's kind of a trick for a lot of different applications. If your piping consistency is a little too thin, it obviously depends on the design, but you can do this kind of trick to get definition in between your lines, is to actually like do 1 layer at a time. It's a little hard to describe conceptually, but I promise it works. So for this one, doing the same technique, this sawing motion back and forth, that's how you get the definition. And yes, I'm actually doing this real time. It looks so fast when I'm doing it in this video. It doesn't feel that fast. In terms of the cut of your leaf, the deeper you do the cut, I don't think I can explain this verbally. The point is that the different like, whether your V is very sharp or very kind of open and wide, it will change the size of your leaf. The more kind of open and wide it is, like the bigger the opening will be and the thicker your leaf will be, which is not necessarily ideal. So I don't know if that made any sense, but hopefully it did. All right, this next one is the snake plant. Love this for us. What else do I want to talk about with this set? Grace. I think I've run out of things to say. We've talked about color. We've talked about consistency. We've talked about the cookies a bit. I would say the only downside, if you can say there's a downside to this set, is the fact that it is 11 different cookie cutters, which is obviously a bit of an investment. This is one of the first classes I did. Let's see, like the fourth or fifth class, I should say online class that I ever did. Obviously, online classes are different than in-person classes because when I'm putting an online class together, I always have the end user in mind. Because I want to, this hobby is kind of challenging enough. I don't also, what am I trying to say? I try to make it as easy on you as possible. So I don't do I don't do sets anymore. I don't do classes anymore that have 11 different cookie cutters. This is just one of those. I had purchased this set of cutters myself in 2020, I think, when it originally came out, because I'd always wanted to do a set of plants. It is actually something in the cookie world that like a lot of people do, plants, and I was like, I need to do this. So I bought this, and when I was putting classes together, I was like, great, this is an opportunity to finally do this set. And while I think it's awesome to have this amount of variety in your arsenal of cutter shapes and techniques, I do see the limiting factor of having to buy all these cookie cutters. But I digress. I'm still really glad that I did it. So that was kind of the impetus for putting this class together. It was just something that I really wanted to do. And when I'm putting a class together, an online class, I really think about the home baker. When I'm doing an in-person class, which I don't really do anymore, I do them like small group, one-on-one, private, on request, but I don't actually advertise them. Anyway, I used to do in-person classes of like 10 to 20 people. And when doing that, I'm just thinking about the decorator's experience and then my own prep. So, the number of cutters doesn't really matter because it's just me buying them. But certainly something like this, like I would not have wanted to teach this as an in-person class because 11 different cookies, oh my goodness. I mean, that would have, like, the class video for this, I think, was like somewhere around 3 hours to begin with. In-person version of that would have been like an entire day, probably like an 8-hour class. And I'm just not about those right now. So, let's talk about the snake plant we're actually doing. We're doing flooding in sections, obviously. So I started with the center ones. I'm trying to think if there was a real reason why I started with the center ones. I mean, generally when flooding in sections, no, I'm going to leave that thought aside. Okay. I do sometimes strategically choose to flood certain sections before others. In this case, I don't know if there was strategy. So let's just talk about what I'm doing here. This was my way of achieving the kind of striation that you see on snake plants. So we're flooding this first. Now you can see that I did not do a squiggle on this. Largely because we're sticking our scribe in there. And if you have a squiggle, that's going to get in the way of manipulating the icing. So for this wet on wet. So I don't know. I guess that's why I decided not to do it. We're putting a line of the dark green through the middle. And then I very intentionally chose my smallest scribe because I wanted as little manipulation as possible. So I went one way first. I went from left to right first. Now I'm going from right to left. I'm obviously not cleaning my scribe off because I want this to look messy. And now here I'm actually doing like a zigzag back and forth. It's just kind of hard to tell, I think, what exactly it is that I'm doing. And there we go. do one more. So I love flooding in sections like this because it adds some simple visual variety. But I will say that even the simplest designs that have flooding in sections, it always takes more time. Like, it always amazes me how much more time these kinds of designs take. So just keep that in mind. Because, like, the more layers of icing, the more times you have to revisit a design, inevitably, the longer it takes. There she is. I think we have one more. Yes, this is the last plant, last potted plant. This is the other basket weave. This is also, I guess, is this the only other application of the sagey green? I think so. Silly Grace. Maybe I should have done more than two. Anyway. A lot of people have said that they thought this shape was actually a person's, like a cartoon character's head. I think I got Lisa Simpson, and then there's another cartoon from a while ago. Doug, was it the Doug cartoon? There's a character in that. Is it Doug? I don't know. That has this kind of crazy hair. I thought that was funny. It's not. It's a potted plant. This is actually supposed to be aloe. And I was a little confused, I will admit, by this design because the leaves, like aloe leaves, are very straight. This is not. We're going to talk about the leaves in a second because I do want to talk about this basket weave. So what's different, remember, about this from the other basket weave is that our initial lines are vertical. And I did want to add a bit of a sense of the shape here, which is why I started with the straight line first, and then I start adding the curve as we go. Gorgeous. Okay, and then I'm going in again right away with this second layer. So the motion that you don't really see me doing is I'm making contact before the line. I'm lifting the icing up over the vertical line, and then I'm touching back down. So in this case, it's like extra important to make sure that you have control over the beginning and the ends of your lines, because if you get big beads at the beginning and ends of your lines, it's not going to be super neat. So just something to keep in mind. The more I look at this, the more I do see like crazy Einstein here. You know, some people do some really awesome cookie cutter flips. I am not one of those people. Okay, so back to these leaves. You can see they kind of have like texture to them, or like not flat sides, which really confuse me because aloe plants do have very straight leaves. So, I don't know. But hashtag close enough. Am I right? I'm right. Okay. So this is the moment I realize I forgot to do the handles. And for this one, it's the same icing that I used for the basket weave. I'm just squeezing the heck out of that bag. And I'm holding the tip of the bag flush to the cookie. So here is an example where I am doing the squiggle. I don't really know where my brain was at because we are going to do a little bit of wet on wet, but there's not quite as much manipulation of the icing as there was in the snake plant. So with the aloe, there's a bit of a two-tone nature to an aloe plant. So this was my attempt at adding that kind of two-tone. This is where it's really important, though, to make sure that you flood immediately on your squiggle, because if you try to do this on top of a crusted squiggle, no fun, my friends. No fun at all. Sorry. I get mesmerized by myself. I will say for this scribe, it is very sharp. Like, could result in red stuff coming out of your finger sharp. So be careful with that, my friends. Okay. So this is one of those cookies where like it feels like it took forever because we had to do it in 1, 2, 2, 3. Okay, maybe it was only 4 stages, but because there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Well, because of the placement of the 6 leaves, stems, arms, whatever you call these things, we had to do the flooding in 3 stages to get the flooding in sections effect. So worth it though, in my opinion. A note on doing these really dark colors. I typically recommend prepping super dark colors 2 days in advance. Normally I do it the night or day before, but giving it 2 days gives it extra time to develop, and you can really make sure that the icing turns out the color you want it to be and not too dark. General rule of thumb, if your icing is the color you want it to be in the bowl, you've gone too far. It will continue to darken and develop as you're bagging the icing, as you're decorating, as it's drying. It will continue to get darker until it's totally dried. So it's very easy to oversaturate really dark colors. That's why giving it more time to develop is good, because then you do an initial coloring 2 days before, several shades lighter than you ultimately need. Give it a day to develop, see where it is, add a bit more coloring, still not to where you ultimately need it to be, and then you give it another day. And then by the morning that you decorate, hopefully it is the color you want. I'd be really careful in adding much more food color after the icing has developed, or the morning of, because if you add more food coloring the morning of, it just, chances are it's going to be too dark. So anyway, that's all I have to say. As always, I hope you learned a thing or two. I hope you enjoyed this video. I hope you try these yourself, or maybe you have no interest in trying them, and that's totally okay. I'm so happy you're here. I'm so happy you spent over an hour with me. And as always, have a blessed day. Have a wonderful day, and cheekily, have a sweet one. Thanks, y'all.